Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Again, my name is Heather Kutzman, and this is our December CounterSketch solution session. Thank you for joining me. I know that it is a busy time of the year for most of you, and so thanks for carving out a couple of minutes to spend with me this morning. On today's webinar, we are going to focus on Pinterest to price examples. Every December, we kind of take a break from our typical format and do a session that is only and entirely Pinterest to price. I will show a slide at the end just featuring some new styles that have been recently added to CounterSketch, but the greater bulk of our time will be spent doing these Pinterest to price examples. This Pinterest to price is unique from others because we call it a viewer's choice. So I've selected 6 different designs. If we have enough time, we'll do all of them. And you can see this initial design is really made up of a solitaire, and then it has these nice 3 accented leaves on either side. And then from those leaves, we've got kind of a very simple band that's radiating out from that. You can notice that the central leaf is larger. It almost covers the entire width of our band, and it has 2 accent stones, whereas these smaller leaves on the side actually don't really rest on the band at all. They're kind of forced out because of this larger center accent piece. They only have 1 stone, and we've got a nice smooth look to everything. So hopefully that gives us an idea. I'm going to hop over into CounterSketch to get this design started. I always encourage you guys, and I know you've heard me probably say this before if you've been on a prior webinar, to start with a library model if you can. And so because this piece is really kind of a classic solitaire, but then with some accent pieces added on, we're going to do that for this example. So I want something that's just a classic solitaire. We saw that the center stone is round, so I'm probably going to limit my search results to only show options that will accommodate a round center. And it was also prong set, so I'm going to select prong set for my filters. So these are going to all be solitaires that will accommodate a round center. Because we have that design work on the side, I really don't want anything that has a cathedral shank to it, because that's going to get in the way of me placing my design. So I'm going to look at all of my designs in a through finger view by left clicking on that little icon on the left. And this shows me the designs. See, a lot of these do have that cathedral happening. And again, if we're going to put that design on the side, then the cathedral might get in our way. So I'm looking for something kind of like this, where we've got not a lot of cathedral happening and something that's fairly simple. I'm going to keep looking and see if I like anything else better, but that one was definitely a good option. This one is nice as well. We have essentially no cathedral happening, and we've got a nice prong set design. I don't love the basket setting on this one. I'd rather something that kind of pinches in at the bottom so that we can add matching bands if we want to. I know that that is definitely something that we get a request for pretty often. And I think that this one looks pretty good. It's a nice simple design. It doesn't have that cathedral, but we do have a nice solid shank for us to add our accent pieces to. So I'm going to left click to start designing on this particular style. Here's our design. We need to make any adjustments to the center stone shape or size and the finger size. Also, if we wanted to change any aspects of the design, such as adding a weighted shank or any of those pieces, we can do that really easily because we're using this library model. The next thing that I want to do is go in and add those accent pieces. So those aren't an option within the library design, but we can always go into our CounterSketch freehand parts and add those components. So let's left click on the plus sign to add a couple of pieces, and we're going to left click on shapes. And this may seem like a strange starting point, but I know that there are some components in here that will work perfectly. Because we oriented all of our designs during our library search to be through finger, that's how all of our components are showing initially in this freehand search. So I'm going to left click on perspective to get everything going back the right way so that I can see the details of the design. As I scroll through these, I've got some options, but none of them have stones in them. So I'm actually going to go to the second page, and on this second page you can see we found exactly what we're looking for. I'm going to double left click on this two-stone version of the piece and add it out onto my screen, because this is, again, almost exactly what I need to fulfill that central piece of my side design. So this is kind of that larger center leaf. Here is the design that we're looking to create, and that freehand part is almost exactly what we see here. So that's what we've added to our screen. So we've got it out there on the screen, and we're just going to position it on the side of our ring. And we can use our viewports to do this if we want. So I can go to my through finger view and kind of left click and drag this component into place. I can look at my top-down view so that I can get the alignment correct. Again, if I hold down Shift on my keyboard while I'm rotating, it's going to ratchet at those 40-degree increments so that it's easier for me to see. And then I need to make some adjustments to the angle here. So we don't really want it to just float out in space, but we still want it to be very visible if you looked at it from a top-down view. So we want to kind of angle this so that we're making good contact with our ring. Alright, and I'm going to go back into perspective view now, just because it makes it a little bit easier for me to rotate this around and see it from all angles. Now the biggest difference between this component and what we saw in our image is that we have mill grain. So I'm going to left click here to remove the mill grain to make this a much smoother presentation. If the design feels too large, you can always come in and make adjustments to the size of the gems. I'm actually pretty happy with the overall scale of this, so I'm probably going to leave it exactly the way it is, but you can always make adjustments here, and you can also adjust the shape. So in our image, I think this is the most accurate representation, but if you are looking for something with a different shape, this component does update to fit different shape options. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking of using this piece for another design. Now that we have one of the pieces on the left side, we can mirror it over to the other side by left clicking on our side mirror option up here at the top. And now you can see all of these components are on there. So we've got the beginnings of our design. We've got this first central leaf. The next thing we want to do is add these side accent leaves, which are a little smaller and only have one gem in the center. So we're going to hop back into CounterSketch, left click on our freehand parts menu, and left click on shapes again. And again, those shapes that we saw that we liked so much are actually back down here on page 2, and then we'll just double left click to add this component out onto our screen as well. So now we have our second component added out there on the screen, and we're going to place it in the same position. So in the same way that we removed the mill grain before, we're going to remove it again just because we don't need it in our design. I'm going to drag this up to about the correct height, and then to either the left or the right to bring it out so I can see it. And then we're going to do some angling. So we need this to kind of go out from the side of our piece at an angle so that it looks like that second leaf in our design. This leaf looks a lot wider than the leaf that we saw in our image. And so I'm going to go over here and make some adjustments to the size. Again, if I want, I can decrease the size of that accent stone, and that will proportionally update my entire piece. Or I can make some changes here. So right now my setting width is set to 0. I actually want it to be even narrower than it is now. So I'm going to left click here and expand my control range, because as you saw, my slider was all the way to the left. And now I'm just going to left click and drag this a little bit to the left, just a little bit at the time. And you're noticing how it's narrowing out the space between that border or edge of my piece and my center stone. So we're just going to do a little bit of that to bring it down and get it more appropriately sized for our design. And that looks a lot better. At this point, again, you can come in and make some adjustments to the angle of the piece. You want to make sure that you keep the thickness of the piece overall in a good place or at a good size, because this is a detail that's kind of floating out in space, and it has the potential to get damaged or hit or banged up against things. So we want to, as much as we can, try to protect it from that and make sure that it's heavy enough to withstand that kind of damage should it occur. So again, we're just going to use kind of our judgment. Obviously, if you're working with your customer, you want to get their input to get the placement the way that we want it. And once we have one of these in place, we're going to left click on quad mirror, and it throws all 4 of those out there on our screen. So now we have this nice floral top that we were looking for. If we want to hide these arrows because they're distracting to the customer, you can always left click on that little blue circle and it takes those away, so it's easier to view and see everything in the design. I think in our original image all of this was in rose gold, so I'm just going to switch everything to a 14 karat rose, and that is how we would go about building that particular style in CounterSketch. Pendant. So we don't cast chains, so we're going to focus just on the pendant itself for this design, but I thought this was a fun one, and so we're going to hop into this design next. Again, in CounterSketch, I started a new session, and I'm just going to start with freehand parts. I do want to make a call out while we're here. Within the elements folder, and I'm pretty sure it's in elements, we may have to look around for a second, there are these gold discs that we've added. So I think these are pretty cool. They're not exactly what we are designing in our image, so I'm not actually going to use one of these, but I do want to call them out to you because I think they're a neat component that you could use if you're designing something similar to this. So just wanted to make sure you guys are aware. Those are components I think that have been added in the last year that would be helpful if you were doing something similar to this. In my case, I'm actually looking for something that is very plain. I don't need any of that decorative detail, but it does have this nice central contour. So you can kind of see in the design that we selected, there's kind of a, and so I'm going to left click on Start Designing to choose this for my option. Anytime I'm doing something freeform like this and in a pendant, a lot of times I will add my grid by left clicking on that little grid icon in the upper right corner. So we've made this nice little concave shape to our pendant by selecting that piece. Now you'll notice in our image there is kind of this hard line between where it makes that transition, and so we're going to actually cover that up with something else, so you'll get to see it. But I'm going to bring out my grid because I want to know how big I need this piece to be. Again, this is something you'll want to discuss with your customer before you begin the design process. You know, do we want it the size of a nickel or a quarter or a dollar, $50? Like, what size of a disc are we looking to create? And then based on that conversation, we can make the scale of this piece as large or as small as we need it. I'm going to go about 10 millimeters, and again I know that because each of these larger blocks is 5, so I've got about 10 millimeters. If I want, I can hover, 10 millimeters on each side. This is 20 millimeters total, and if I hover over that little scaling disc, I can see that dimension on my screen. So again, if we decided on 10, let's undo. We would need to use our 3-dimensional scaling disc to make it smaller, and then we could come in here and kind of check our dimension in that one-dimensional scaling disc. I like this larger, and I think it's going to be easier to see as I'm designing, so I'm going to go closer to 20 for the overall size. When I scaled it three-dimensionally, it obviously made everything much larger, including the thickness. And most of the time on this type of a piece, I would say go about 2 millimeters. You can go thinner than that, but we definitely want something that's going to hold up nicely. And so for that reason, we're going to go with about a 2 millimeter thickness. And remember that 2 millimeters is at its thickest point. So that's out here on the edge. As we work our way into the center, it's going to get thinner. So there's a start for our pendant. The next thing I want to focus on is going to be this rope ring. So that rope ring is what I'm going to create next, and it's going to help cover up that sharp delineation that we currently have on our component. So right now we have this kind of crease that I don't really like. It doesn't follow the look of my piece, so I want to cover that up. So I'm going to go into my freehand parts, left click on the plus sign, and then left click on wire, rope, and knot. And again, if you've watched webinars in the past, you know that we use this mill grain rope piece quite a bit. But you'll notice that in addition, we have some other rope components here that we can choose from as well. So this is a nice one. I like this one a lot too. This one has more, I think I would call it like a macaroni look. And then this has more of like a basket or a wheat chain type weave to it. So we've got a couple of different ones to choose from. I really like this rope design, so I'm going to start here. Also, if you go back this other way, this one's really nice too. So any of these could be used. I'm going to use this, this particular one to get us started. So you'll notice that it comes out and it looks pretty nice, but all of my rope detail is facing out instead of up, which would be great if I were making a ring, but I'm making a pendant, so I need to reorient it. So if I look over here in my design stack on the left, you can see that I have an option for a bead twist. Currently, it's at -90 degrees. If I left click and drag this towards the right, it will eventually come to 0, which is what I'm looking for. And now you can see that that rope bead twist reoriented, so we've got it nicely placed facing up on my design, which is what I want. Again, part of what I'm using this for is to cover that kind of unsightly crease between my concave surfaces. So I'm going to left click and drag my width in just a little bit so that it starts to line up, and you can see it's already starting to cover that piece. So we're just going to drag this to the left, and it starts to cover that crease for us. There we go. So much better. That gives us that contour that we wanted, and now we have our rope. If there's other things that you want to change about this, don't be afraid to play with some of these sliders. So obviously our shape is correct. There's no need for us to make adjustments there, but we can play with our bead dome to make it more pronounced if we feel like it's too recessed. The other thing we can do is change the start and end position if we only wanted it to cover a fraction of our circle. And then we can also change the bead size and make this larger. But keep in mind that when you change the bead size, you may also need to make adjustments to the spacing to make sure that you don't lose that kind of compact rope shape that we were hoping for. So again, that gives us our starting point for that rope design in the center of our pendant. The next piece is going to be this nice star that we have. We can take the time to build this out because we have a couple of different requests for today. I'm not going to build this out. I'm just going to use a part from the library, but you could definitely create this design for the star if you wanted. However, sometimes the stars that are in the library are actually better than what we started with. So I'm going to go in, and you can look, there's a bunch in religious, or there's at least a couple in religious that have the potential to work, or kind of a combination of these stars with others. I'm going to go back, oops, sorry, I'm going to go to shapes, and I think this is where I found the one that I really liked and kind of stood out to me. Again, we're spending a lot of time on shapes today. This is a good one. This is another great star. You can kind of look through and find, again, this one may be reoriented, like so place it once and then rotate it 90 degrees and kind of place it on top of itself would be another nice option. This has some nice detailing to it. This one's beautiful too. So there's a bunch of stars in here, so don't feel like you have to create the star from scratch. I love this one. I think this one's really pretty. So it's the one that I added when I went through and was practicing with this. So we're going to go back to our star, bring him up so he's sitting on our surface, and then scale the whole thing up until we get the size that we want. Again, this is going to completely depend on what you and your customer have discussed and how you want the finished product to look. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to add that diamond detail, so I'm going to go into my settings this time, and I'm just going to look for a bezel set stone to add to the very center to kind of add that little diamond accent that we have in the center. So we've got it out there. It's way too big, so we're going to left click and drag this to the right. I think 0.8 is too small, so maybe going to go with a 1.3. And again, it's kind of in the center of my design, so I just need to raise it up so that it can sit at the top. And that looks pretty good. So we've got a good start going. We need to add those gold spheres that are at kind of, I would say 3, 6, and 9. So again, we'll go back into our freehand parts, look under shapes, and within our shapes we actually have just a gold sphere. And that's what we're going to use to add on to our piece. So here it is. Double left click to bring it out onto our screen. And if you want, this is sometimes where I will go into a top view and just drag this to the right. And the reason I go in the top view is it helps give me a little bit of perspective as far as the overall scale of my piece and how large I want these gold spheres to be. So kind of the scale is what I'm looking for here. And I'm pretty happy with that one. I'm going to use my polar array to place the other two just because it's a quick way to do that action. So let's left click on the blue square, and that takes us to bend. We don't need to bend this component, we just want to use polar array. So we'll left click on the blue square again, and that takes us to polar array. Then we'll left click on our polar array icon to turn it on. Our start position is the red handle, which we can leave, and our end position is the blue handle, which we're just going to drag over to 180 degrees because that's where we want our other, I guess that would be our 9 o'clock position. Right now this circle is repeating 3 or 5 times, and we only need it to repeat 3. So we're just going to left click on that green arrow, which tells us how many times the design repeats, and drag it to the left to decrease the number of times that it repeats. And that looks really good. That's what we were hoping for. So I'm going to left click on the blue box again just to turn off those polar array handles. And now we need to add our pendant connection piece at the top. So we're going to add an O-ring going in this direction and then an O-ring going in the other direction. So let's head back. We're going to go into our freehand parts. Wire, rope, and knots is where we're going to start, and we're just going to double left click on that O-ring and add it out onto our screen. It comes out and it's really large. You can kind of see it here. So we're going to come over here to the left side and make this whole thing a lot smaller. So I'm going to go to about 1.5 for my width and length. Oops, a little bit too far. And I'm going to make it a little bit not quite so heavy. So let's again go to maybe 1.5 and see how that looks. And And that still looks a little heavy to me, so I'm going to go just a little bit smaller, maybe 1.3. And then we're just going to place that ring into our coin. And again, if at any point you're not sure about the height, you can always change your angle to view this a little bit differently. I actually, now that I'm looking at it this way, I want my spheres to be closer into my metal. And so I can just select one of these, left click and drag, and all of them are moving in at the same amount. So that's another great benefit of using polar array. Whenever I make adjustments to my initial component, everything else changes. So we've got this. This, as it sits right now, would be a single one-piece casting. If I wanted to go ahead and add the other ring, I could do that, but then I'm going to have two casting fees. So kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about these second components. So I will go ahead just to complete the look and come in here and left click to choose this option menu, and then choose the second option, which is to duplicate the selected item. That takes that original piece and just duplicates it out there on my screen. And I'm just going to rotate this 90 degrees. So if I left click and hold down shift on my keyboard, that rotated it 90 degrees, and now I can drag it up. For this ring, I actually want it to be larger because my chain needs to pass through it. So I'm going to increase the inside length and width, maybe to about 4 millimeters. And then I'm going to drag it up as well. But that gives you an idea of how you might create. That may have gotten a little big. Let's go back to a 3. There we go. That seems more in proportion. And then again, in our original image, all of this was 14 karat yellow. So I'm going to update my piece. So now you can kind of see how those components could come together to create a pendant like we saw. So this is our inspiration piece and then our final design. Again, you can always use within your freehand parts if you left click on the plus sign. Within here we do have some chains. Unfortunately, we don't have anything as decorative as the chain in the image, but we do have some kind of fancy stuff that you can add in. So we'll just grab this chain. It adds it out onto our screen, and then we can place it in our design kind of where it would naturally live. And that sometimes will help to give the customer a better image. Again, to help with that, we can remove our grid. We can left click to hide all of those blue dots. And now we can get a more realistic image of what that finished piece might look like. We've got enough time, so probably what I'm going to do is start with B and then we'll move on to see if we have time, but I think that we will. So we're going to hop into CounterSketch, and this one is pretty straightforward. Again, if you wanted to, you could start with a solitaire from the library. This was a little bit harder to locate, for me at least, and so what I did is I just built from freehand parts, but there is a design that will work. It's just you have to rotate, change the orientation of the center stone, and pull a few tricks like that to make it all come together, but it is a possibility. However, for ease and quickness, I'm going to grab a freehand shank and add it out onto our screen. Once that freehand shank is on there, I'm just going to left click to remove the gems because we don't want those gems, and then I will add a setting. So for our central setting, I'm going to go into settings, and it's not really an emerald cut. If you look at it, it's more of a baguette. So I'm going to choose only options that have a baguette center, and it's also a bezel set. So I'm going to add this bezel set baguette option. If we update this stone, so we're going to switch this to be our baguette shape. And this is the only, I would say, kind of interesting or tricky part of this design, is that we actually want the baguette to be oriented in an east-west orientation rather than north-south the way it comes out. And so I need to change the rotation of this gem. And typically, because we're fast designers and we like to use the handles on our screen, it's just easier to rotate using our viewport control handles. But because this is a ring and we need that center setting to contour to the curvature of our ring rail, we're going to have to change the rotation over here on the left hand side using our design stack. So I'll do it the wrong way so you guys can see how that works. So if I come in here and just rotate this right away, okay, I've got that going the right direction. But now when I add my bezel bottom bend to make it contour to my ring, that bend is happening at this end of my piece. So it doesn't give me the result that I want, and so I'm kind of stuck with something that it's not what I needed. So I'm going to undo that rotation, get it back to center, and now instead I'm going to use the rotation over here on the right. So we just want to go 90 degrees. Now it's correct, and now when I add that bezel bottom bend, my contour is cutting through my piece the correct way. So again, just a little recommendation on using that component. I may make my center gem just a slight bit bigger. Maybe we'll go 9x6 instead of 8x4. That looks a little big. Maybe we'll go 9x5. All right. And if it's hard to see, which for me it is, I will usually come into our freehand components and add a ring rail guide out onto my screen, and that'll just help me to line things up a little bit better. It's a fairly quick thing to add a ring rail guide, and then there's no guessing on my part. I can be sure that everything is correctly positioned. So, and again, if you go to your through finger, all of this even does better. So there we go. And now I'm going to select my shank and decrease my top span so that these come into contact. Once we have everything connected for the base of our ring, the next step is just to add those trillion components on the side. So I'm going to go back into my settings, select a center stone shape of a trillion, and then I need prong set, so this is my one and only option. The good news is that it's a very versatile option, and so we can make it work. So we've got our center stone out there. We're going to update the shape to be a trillion. If we're working with a specific customer and they have specific gem sizes, obviously we want to put all of that in. I'm just going to decrease these in size. I think they're a little large for accent stones, so I'm going to take them down to closer to 1/3 of a carat. And then we'll just drag this component up in line with our center stone and drag it forward. Now the first thing that you'll notice as far as differences between this design and our image is that we have V prongs on our trillion, and in our image we had regular rounded prongs. So I'm going to hop back into CounterSketch and change these prongs. And to do that, I'm just going to look at the setting options, and this first option is for V prongs, and that takes us back to regular. We've got a couple of different prongs configurations to choose from, but what we've got here works for me, so that's what we're going to do. I'm also going to do just a little bit of angling with this. So I want the metal of my setting to have more contact with my central setting. And so I'm just angling it a little bit so that that is easier. We don't want to angle it so much that it starts to cut into our ring rail. But as I'm doing this, I can also come in maybe and make an adjustment to the overall height of that setting, making it a little bit lower. And when I do that, I might find that I don't really have a need for two rails, I just need one. So I can come in and also remove that upper gallery rail so that I can see everything a little bit more easily. And now I'm happier with that arrangement. Once we've got one in there, we need to mirror it over the top of our design so that we've got two. And then the last component that we need to add are these little 3-prong set round stones that go on the outside of our trillions. So again, we'll hop back into CounterSketch, left click on our freehand part menu, and we will scroll until we find our 3-prong set option. So this guy here. And the way it's configured in our ring is that that single prong is kind of radiating out to the corners, and then the 2 prongs are closer in. So that's what we want to try to repeat with our design. So we've got it, it's out there on our screen, and it is honestly way too big. So we'll come in here and decrease the size, and we'll start with a 2mm and see how that works. I'm just going to drag it up to approximately the right height. Right now it's kind of hiding in the center of my piece, and I'll drag it out to one side. And actually, if you look at it, this single prong should be going that direction. So if I want, I can kind of move it over so that it's on the right side. So now you can kind of see this one, without me having to make any rotation to it, is oriented in the correct direction. And that's what we want. So I'm going to place him in there. I've also got some height problems with this. I don't really like having that double bar for something that's an accent. So I want to decrease the overall height on this piece. Not too much, but just a little bit. And then when I do that, I can also remove that upper gallery rail so that I get a nice controlled piece. And what I do love about this, you can add as many prongs or take as many prongs away as you want and change the location. It's a great versatile setting for what we're doing. That's really the only change that we need to make, but you can kind of see where there's a lot of options with this particular style. And again, like we saw with our last one, once we have one in position, we're just going to left click on our quad mirror option to repeat this all around our gem or our design. I'm going to change my gemstone colors and my material colors to line up. I think it's really more of it almost to me looks like December's birthstone, which is a blue zircon, but I'm not seeing it right away. So I'm just going to pick something that looks kind of like a blue zircon. And if you look and remember our image, it's just the amethyst trillions that we need to change out now. So let's head back. We're going to use our any gem, any color option for this. Select those 2 trillions that need to be amethyst and click apply. And then we'll click done. And I believe that our entire piece is in a 14 karat yellow, so we can update that as well. And that is our third design and kind of how it comes together in CounterSketch. So this third one is going to be a little bit of a challenge. As you know, if you've been designing in CounterSketch for very long, we actually do not have any cabochon settings. We do have a couple of library designs that have cabochons, but if we're creating from freehand parts, unfortunately we do not have a cabochon setting. But we're lucky because this is a bezel cabochon setting, and so we're going to kind of, you know, play with this design a little bit. We're going to use some things that maybe aren't exactly cabochons but will give us a similar look to create this piece. You'll also notice that we've got these tapered, smaller accent gem options that are out here that are also kind of a fun thing to play with. So definitely this is going to be a fun one to create, and we will go ahead and get started. Similar to our last design, there's nothing really in the library that looks like this, so I'm just going to grab a plain shank and bring it out into CounterSketch. And then we're just going to find a bezel setting that's closed. So it doesn't have to be a cabochon necessarily. I'm just going to look at my settings and select a plain bezel to go with. Once it's out there, we want to get the size correct as well. So it looks closer to like an 8mm or maybe a 9mm to me, so we'll go in the middle. And I'm going to do something a little odd, and that's I'm going to take my depth and put it to like 2, because most opals do not have a lot of depth to them. When I see it as a diamond facet, it looks really weird on my screen, but I'm more concerned with getting the depth of my setting correct than having kind of a perfect look on that screen. The other thing that you'll notice is because this is a setting for a faceted stone, the bezel has a taper to it. But with cabochon stones, we typically don't need that much of a taper. And so I'm going to change my setting bezel angle and try to make it a little bit straighter. So I'm going to drag it to the right, and that gives me the ability to kind of straighten out that bezel wall to make it more appropriate for a to make it more appropriate for a cabochon stone. Next, we're going to decrease the height of the gem. So as we do this, you'll see our overall height of our bezel starts to shrink. And we do want to get it low, but at the same time, we also know that we have those metal kind of and diamond stars that are radiating from the center. So we want to give enough height in our bezel for those things to be attached. The other thing we need to do is add the bend. So we need to add that contour to our bezel as well. And if we need to, we can expand this control range and bring our height down even more after we do that bend. So that gives us a start. Again, you want to make sure that you know your center stone size before you go too far in all of this, because when we start laying out those other components, it's going to be important that we have the center correct. I'm going to add a ring rail again because I'm trying to line up my setting and my shank, and I don't want to have any errors there. So I'm going to go to my through finger view, place my setting on that curvature of my ring rail, go to my shank and decrease my top profile span until those make contact. And in this case, I do not need those gems on my band. So we've just created our base, and now you can see I've left us enough space around that bezel to attach those kind of rays of our star that are going to attach as well. So if we go back here, now we can see that we need to start adding these other components. So our largest ray is what we're going to start with, and it's at 4 corners of our design. And I like using a strip setting for this. So we're going to go into settings, And within our settings, we're going to select a strip setting. So there's a couple of them in here. It may surprise you, but I'm actually going to use this one because it gives me the ability to taper. So we'll add this one out. In our use case, we actually need it to be flat. So where it says the ring rail curve through the finger is by default at 45, I'm just going to take it down to 0 because we want this thing to be flat. And there we go. The other thing we need to do is kind of get it into position. So I'm going to rotate it to 90 degrees so that it can kind of radiate from our center. And then I'm just going to pick a side to attach it to. It's also super long to start out with, so we need to make the overall length quite a bit shorter, maybe something closer to a 5, maybe even less than that, again kind of depending on your conversation with your customer. And you'll remember from our image that we only have 3 stones on this ray, and they actually taper from larger to smaller. So let's see if we can get that worked out here on our component. So you'll notice down here within this strip setting options, we have a start diameter and an end diameter, but we have to enable that end diameter. So I'm going to turn that on to start. Again, the start diameter is 1.2. Maybe for the end diameter, I'm only going to go to 1.5. And as soon as I make that change, I can see that I've done it the wrong direction. So no big deal. We'll just flip-flop these. So we'll go to 1.2 and then 1.5. And there we go. So now we've got our smaller stones at the end, larger at the beginning. And again, you can see here that we actually have about 5 stones, and we only need 3. So this is where we're going to make adjustments to our end position. That end position will push our stones closer to the center of our piece rather than being out on the end. So let's change our end position, bring this in a good bit, and that gets us to 3. And it gets us to 3 with 2 prongs, which is what I like. The only problem or thing that's a little challenging with this is that you'll notice the end position moves from both ends, not just one. And so if I don't want a lot of extra metal on the inside, I do need to kind of sink this down into my ring. It doesn't overlap that badly into the center of my setting, so it's not a big deal, but it is something I wanted to call out. The other thing that you'll notice is that the width of this piece is consistent from one end to the other, and in order to make these look like rays, we need not only our gems to taper, but also our metal. So let's hop back over and make those adjustments as well. So in here, let's see, I think it's at the very top. Yeah, so profile width A, and again you may have to play with this to see which one goes first. There we go, that's the one we want. Is going to make this narrower, so that looks pretty good. And then again, it's up to you. Do you want to make B narrower just a slight bit or a lot? You can kind of play with this to decide. Now that I've got one of these laid out, I want to use my polar array to place them on all 4 corners. So we're just going to drag this 360 degrees, and it defaults to a count of 4. So that gets me started. You'll also see I've got this almost at the bottom of my bezel setting. So let's drag this whole thing up just a little bit more so that it's more consistent. My thickness is okay, but we may come back and make changes to that again later. So that gets us started there. You can kind of see how this is coming together and taking shape. I'm going to turn off my polar array handles for now. I'm going to take this component and I'm just going to duplicate it. So come in here, duplicate that initial piece. And this is a little bit harder to line up, so I'm going to bring out my grid, go into my top-down view, And then I just want to move this piece here and kind of rotate it. And again, we've got our polar array on, so everything is updating consistently. But it may take a little bit of back and forth to get this exactly where you want it. Use that grid as best you can to kind of help you with this placement. So maybe I want to drag this a little bit more to the right, drag it in a little bit more. And what I may try to do is kind of center this gem on that little cross hatch of those pieces underneath and drag it in a little bit more. So it's not going to be perfect, but it'll get really close, I bet, if you guys can kind of see it and do it that way. The other thing about these is they only have 2 gems and they are shorter than our rays at the points. So we're going to come in here and just decrease our length of those pieces. So we've got that piece selected. We'll decrease our length, and we may need to expand our control range to decrease it even more. And what's great about this is that as you're decreasing that length, it's also adjusting the number and the placement of those gems. And if I'm not crazy about the placement, then I can always come in and go back to making adjustments to my endpoint. So down here's my endpoint. I'm going to expand that control range again, and then we'll decrease that endpoint, and that kind of drives those gems closer together so that if we want a 2-prong arrangement, I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little bit better, we can get it. And then again, we're just going to bring these closer in so that we get a lower height and slight adjustments the whole time. So that gives you that idea. You will notice that on these, they've gone back and added some bead texturing to the ends to kind of make it look a little bit shinier. You can do that the same way we did with the pendant, where you just add those spheres out onto the screen. The last piece is super easy, so if you can hang in with me for a couple more minutes, we'll finish it up. We're going to left click on our shapes. Once we're in shapes, there's all kinds of beautiful triangles if you wanted to add something a little bit more detailed. I think we just need something flat to mimic what we see in the design. So we're going to add that out onto the screen, and then we'll just place it where it needs to live in our design. So let's go into perspective, drag this up, and then forward. Same thing as before. It's going to kind of go in between, so if it's easier to look at this in a top-down view, you can. And we just want it to kind of be placed here in the middle of those other 2. And then I'm going to do a 1-dimensional scale to bring it in. And then if I need to, I can do a 3-dimensional scale to also make it shorter. And don't be afraid to play with this 1-dimensional scale if you like it. If it's getting you the result that you need, that's a great tool to use. Again, we're looking at this from a top-down view so that we can get our placement correct. And as always, once we have one of these components in the correct position, then we can left click on that blue circle or that blue square until we see our polar array icon. Left click to turn on polar array. Bring this all the way around to 360, and then increase our count until we have one of those rays separating each of our diamond rays. And then we'll left click on the blue box to turn off our polar array handles, go into perspective, and take a look and see what we think. This is where I would go in and do some fine tuning. We may need to make these thicker. We may need to adjust the height of these different rays if we wanted to give it a little bit more dimension. but this should give you a really good starting place for creating this design. My one note is because this is for a cabochon opal. When you submit this design to CAD/CAM, you do want to make them aware that you'll be swapping out this center stone for a cabochon stone so that they can make adjustments to the setting accordingly. But that is how I would go about creating that design in CounterSketch. This is a showing of the most recent styles that have been added to the library. These are some really great on-trend styles, so if you haven't taken a look at them yet, please do. Reminder, please follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're posting announcements there on a regular basis about any promotions or sales that we have going on. And it's just a great way to kind of share what you're doing in CounterSketch and see what others are doing as well. We do have a recording of this webinar, which you can access by going to stellar.com/webinars. We're going to do a little post-production editing on this this week, and early next week we should have everything ready to go so that you can go in and watch that recording by going to this page and clicking on Watch Now. Next month, we are going to have a January solution session for CounterSketch. It's going to be on Thursday, January 14th at 9 a.m. Central. We'll do Pinterest to price examples as well as discuss global versus local rotation when you're working in freehand. I get questions on this. It's a more refined tool that you may not use that often, but when you do need it, you'll be happy you know how to use it. So we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that. And then, as always, we'll go over some new designs that have been added to the library. To sign up for this January solution session, just go to stellar.com/webinars, which is the same place where you can view the recording. And finally, if there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at countersketch@gemvision.com, and we'll be happy to get to those. Again, I know it's a busy time of the year. I'm hoping that you all are planning to have a very happy holiday, and I do appreciate you taking the time to join me for the webinar today.